Charles, I should have prepared some spooky music because it's extremely scary in here today. We've got an episode of the Moochers about these judicial families that are mooching off of charities and 501c3 nonprofits. How are you today, Charles?
I'm feeling great. I hope you're well. And you're going to get around to dusting that place behind you in the next 100 years?
Well,
what?
Yeah, this is my haunted theme office. So you can see it's a little scary in here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But excellent job on the poster and on the office by the art and the physical, what is it called? The visual effects department now. We have the art department and the visual effects department and the script department.
What we've got here in the Munsters poster, because they're like a creepy, horror family. This is Judge Boasberg, his sister, and her husband. And we're going to talk a bit about how it's really amazing, Charles, because, it's been almost 10 years, really. And you were doing it before you and I got together and started doing shows. But you've been telling everybody about how these 501c3 nonprofit, sometimes called non-governmental organizations are just an unbelievable network of theft. And it's amazing that finally now we've got the two most famous people in the world basically talking about exactly what you've been telling us.
Well, actually, to give credit where it's due, I think there was a senator or a congressman, I think he was from Ohio, who warned about this in the 50s. Really? Back a long time ago, U.S. federal income tax rates reached for the wealthy a peak of, I think, over 90%. And, that's federal rates before you get to state and city.
Wow.
And so there was a long period where it was felt to be normal to go after the rich aggressively in ways that the founders would explicitly outlawed. I mean, the founders prohibited an income tax. They debated it. They thought it was a very bad idea. They predicted the mess that we're in. And they were pretty fucking smart people, way smarter than AOC, which is not a high bar, or Jasmine, I got no rocket in my crocket. So what the fear was back then is that people who had either created businesses or inherited wealth and had a very low cost of a stock holding would put that holding into a nonprofit, let the nonprofit take the gain, when they sold the stock, and use the proceeds to finance their lifestyles, to pay for their mistresses, to do hijinks or whatever. So that this idea that nonprofits might be abused is not, wasn't an original thought of mine, but the scope of it, on the other hand, it is now de rigueur, I think, if you're on the Democrat left, to have one arm of the family hold a job, let's say in the private sector or a paying job in politics, and the other arm of the family, including kids, to get involved in as many nonprofit scams as possible. Believing correctly, when I got into the Clinton Foundation, there's so much to think about. You can, I don't want to spend every second of every day thinking about it, but one of the things I uncovered was that the forms that you file in Arkansas, the Secretary of State receives most of them, and their responsibility is explicitly ministerial, which I thought about. What does that mean? It's a bunch of, preachers getting together and praying about the form. What it means is that all the Secretary of State cares about is if the form is filled in. They don't check anything. And the argument for that, this is in Arkansas, so the argument for that is that there's so many forms that are filed that you would need to have, a lot of people working in Arkansas
read all that, Charles,
to do their job. Well, so then the next question I asked, getting into this a bit more deeply yesterday, I thought to myself, well, Arkansas is just sloppy. No other state's going to be like this. Every freaking state in America takes the same position as does Washington, D.C. So you find the problem with the form. You then have to convince somebody to do something about it. And going into Arkansas and saying, listen, your former governor and somebody who might be president of the United States, and folks who built the biggest complex in the biggest city in Arkansas, the Clinton Foundation. All of this is a fraud. We need to undo it. Nobody in Arkansas is going to do that, right? So, and the same seems to be true in places like Washington, D.C. and New York City and Chicago, and I could go on and on, mostly blue places. So the real problem we have is we have decades of crooked folks pumping out people like these judges and their family members and many others of them into these very limited number of slots. When you say there's 700 district court judges for 335 million people, that's not that many. And so if you're George Soros, if you're Bill Gates, if you're the people behind the Clintons and the Obamas and the Bushes and all that, it's a trivial exercise to band together and corrupt the process of inserting the right judges, the judges who will not only fail to enforce the rules, but grift off the system. If everybody's doing that, then what you have to do is you have to make examples of the worst offenders, and you have to be serious. And how can you be serious if some of the people in the Trump administration themselves have been around crooked charities?
Right. Well, and some maybe allegedly still are. Charles, if I could offer you a little bit of input from experience that expands on what you just said. The thing that I've observed, so I never knew anything about nonprofits until you told me about the Clinton Foundation and all of that stuff. But the nonprofits, it's essentially a network of organizations that can, donate money from one to the other, and none of them are paying tax on it. So it's almost like a Walhalla system. I've called it the American Walhalla system because it can kind of move cash around a network, and these nonprofit things can hire for-profit things like law firms. And I observe that is one way that this nonprofit money is laundered into the for-profit sector, because these judges can have family members who work for nonprofits that hire law firms that someday will produce attorneys that will themselves become judges. And it's like this self-fueling network of criminal corruption that, we could talk for hours and hours about the things that these judges have done that shouldn't be able to be done.
Let's back, as you like to say, let's back that truck up a little bit here. And let's talk, for example, about the decision to employ a family member. Now, in the private sector, in fiercely competitive fields, investment banking used to be one. I think I got 3 job offers out of Harvard Business School in 1980. I was a middling student. I wasn't top of the class and I wasn't bottom of the class. But to get those 3 job offers, I had to go through at least 50 interviews, not more than that. And, we all were, those of us who wanted to go to Wall Street, we were all competing for a very limited number of jobs. What I see, for example, in the Clinton Foundation, you pluck, Chelsea out of a series of sinecure jobs, right? She starts out, she gets a job at McKinsey, all right? And who makes sure she gets hired? A guy who later goes to prison, Rajat Gupta. Then magically she gets a job in was it ABC, NBC, one of the big places where she's overpaid, she doesn't produce anything. And the people at the company are told, don't talk to Chelsea unless she talks to you first. How many people? It's ridiculous.
Don't look her in the eyes. Doesn't Hillary have some, don't look at her?
Yeah, she's too important. I told my children, and my parents told me, you have to succeed on your own, right? You have to eventually, we can do things together as a family, but you have to go out into the real world and test your mettle against real competitors, and you have to feel that you won on your own. If you go through your entire life, with this cloud over you, I got this job because my parents set the thing up for me. You could do that at Ford Motor Company. You control the company. You're the largest shareholders. You can have a Ford run the company into the ground, which is what happened. And
yeah, they don't do that anymore. It's Chris Farley's cousin running it. I like Ford.
But what I'm saying is, with regard to the Clinton Foundation, I'm now convinced that Bill and Hillary were at the bottom of their law school classes. They are not smart when it comes to the law. Clever people. I wouldn't have to have spent 10 years of my life on this if they had simply filled the paperwork out properly, not elegantly, just properly. There's so many obvious flaws in what they've done. And Chelsea Clinton is basically running this thing into the ground, right? You don't have a right to do that. You don't have a proprietor under the law in Arkansas, the way I read it, and I think the way it is across the country. Nobody has a proprietary right, i.e. the right to hand down an interest in a foundation to a family member. You just don't have that right. But the Clintons are asserting that right. And they've asserted it and tried to paper it by changing the bylaws to give her this lifetime patronage position where she can hire her friends and she can fly private at the expense of a public charity. She can stay in fancy hotel rooms. She can go around the planet speaking at conferences and have her expenses paid. It's ridiculous. And that's people have been. I think the Clintons were the first to be this bold. When Bill think of what happened, and this is your limited hangout theory. Think about what happened as Bill left the White House door, allegedly members of his party stealing White House furniture. He's even Jimmy Carter, throws a temper tantrum over the Mark Rich problem. Pardon. Your point about limited hangouts, I think Mark Rich was not the most egregious person to have been pardoned. I think Susan Rosenberg was. And Susan Rosenberg today was very much involved in the creation of Act Blue, which stands as the most odious monster out there, obvious monster out there still running, that has been a conduit for crooked cash, likely back from Ukraine into the U.S., stolen in Ukraine, sent into Act Blue. A large portion of that money was used to finance Tampon Tim and the babbling idiot who, in 107 days spent $1 to $2.5 billion. Nobody's really sure yet. Okay, the fact that the George W. Bush did nothing about the Clinton Foundation when the FBI was investigating it for 4 years during his first term, tells me that the FBI investigation was just a game. People in the early days of the George W. Bush administration, when he was selected, not elected, according to Hillary Clinton, hotheads decided they were going to go after the Clintons. Not cooler heads, crooked heads went into the hotheads and said, "Listen, you can't do this. If you go after the Clintons, we're going to reveal the truth of what George H.W. Bush did with the Contras." And a lot of people were involved with that. So they said, okay, fine, we'll have the optics of investigation. Just as happened in 2016, we'll have FBI agents, we'll pick the dumbest ones we can find and the dumbest assistant U.S. attorneys, and we'll pretend that we're doing something. And in the end, we'll say, you know what, we don't think we could win a prosecution. And that's, I think, what happened with that. And when people saw that happen, people on the right, people on the left, they said, you know what? It's tough to invent a new product or provide a new service. It's tough to manage things. Why don't we just fuck around for our entire lives and steal whatever isn't nailed down? And that's what's been going on. There are some charities that are good, but too many of them, any charity that is connected to anybody involved in politics, living or dead, is not a charity, is my guess.
Seems like all of them, though, Charles. I mean, it's really... it's gotten unbelievable because, Laura really was breaking ground when she found that Juan Merchan's daughter was running that whole political company. And then now more recently, she figured out that Boasberg's daughter was working for some company. So, that got me poking around. And of course, the other day, I found, Boasberg's sister and her husband had that Beerley Boasberg Foundation. We were looking at that. The husband was also boasting about a friend of his who was working for P. Diddy. This has really captured people's attention. This tweet has gone to nearly 2 million, 1.7 million in just over 24 hours. People are interested in this topic, Charles.
They should be. And actually, Bill Clinton wrote a book. We've talked about it called Giving. I call it Taking because he got millions of dollars for writing it. It was a travel log, you know. Now let's turn our attention to the quail resting over there beneath the rock. The feathers are very pretty. I mean, it went from episode to disconnected episode featuring people for their good works. But even he writes there, actually, Jason, that in dollar volume, the overwhelming, and maybe these are crooked too, but the overwhelming percentage of gifts is given to temples and churches and mosques and whatever by people who donate, may donate $100 a year. And again, maybe all that stream of money going in there, maybe that's a large slice of it is stolen too. But there are good charities out there. I don't want to say all charities are bad. I know of some that play by the rules and do good things. But too many of them have cottoned to the obvious fact that our IRS, our FBI, and our Department of Justice, and many states' attorney general are not in the business of rooting out fraud. They're in the business of protecting fraudsters. Yeah. Chief among them are many of the big donors, the biggest donors to these politicians. I mean, Anybody today, I don't care how rich you are, anybody who is giving, let's say in a total year, $10,000 or more to politicians, in my mind, is deeply suspicious. And when you start getting into $1 million a year, 10 million a year, 100 million a year, those pools, those people who are writing those type of checks, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're just not. You don't. And indeed, I had anecdotal reports late in 2016, as we got into the election itself. Somebody I know either was at a party or had a friend who was at a party in Washington, D.C., which was assumed to be mostly Democrat. And somebody in the room was bragging about what the Clinton Foundation was going to do once Hillary became president. They were saying, it's very simple. You give us $1 million and we'll give you $100 million back various ways, is what they were saying in this cocktail party. And I believe that. I believe that probably is the case.
Ridiculous. Well, but so
it's
Charles,
our money.
To expand again on what you're saying, it's not just the corrupt foundations, because I think what we're learning now, like any problem you study for a long time, we're getting more details here. So we spoke about Laura found that whole thing, and then I found the sister connected to the Beerley-Boasberg Foundation. So this morning we heard that federal judge Ana Reyes blocked Trump's effort to ban transgender troops from the military. I mean, this is from the standpoint of it being a military action carried out by the president, even more egregious really than the deportation of a undocumented individual, because that's at least dealing with kind of like civilian matters. It doesn't have to do with the military. Here, to have this judge impede on a military decision, it seems particularly egregious. So again, I just started looking around at this judge, and it turns out that her partner is this Dr. Xanthe Sharf. And I learned that because Xanthe Sharf had made a post on LinkedIn saying, "Ooh, congratulations to my partner, Ana Reyes, for getting appointed as a federal judge." And of course, this second half of this couple is the CEO, I believe, of this Freedom Fund, which is a nonprofit. She went to Columbia University, which is a hotbed for weather underground activity, where Susan Rosenberg was quite active with protests. And we see this guy, Mahmoud Khalil. We also, Charles, with the release of these JFK files, although there's maybe not anything earth-shifting with, in terms of people who are following JFK, they did admit that they were recruiting Venezuelan students to try to infiltrate Cuba and stuff like that. So why would we think they'd be doing that type of recruiting on college campuses of foreign students in the 1960s, but not today?
Exactly. But you're just going back to this question of the authority of these judges. Mark Levin sometimes he doesn't take as far as he should, and sometimes his show could be, am I going to have a heart attack on the show? He gets so mad and he turns red. But he caused me to go back and look at the Constitution. And I don't know I think it's Article 3 of the Constitution. I may be wrong. But in the Constitution, unless I'm misreading the Constitution and there's some law that supplants the Constitution, it says, I think the authority of the judicial branch shall be vested in a Supreme Court. And then Congress can decide what other courts they want to establish and fund.
Right.
The way I read that. Then
Right.
I believe there's a 1948 Supreme Court decision on the Alien Act, having to do with the Alien Act, involving a German, I think it's Luddecke or something like that, a German who was removed. And that precedent, I think, pretty clearly indicates that Trump is absolutely within his rights to deport these enemy invaders here. And this Boasberg, is basically just grandstanding. And he thinks that he's helping the cause, the resistance, etc. This is an activist judge who, if you can't impeach him, Dershowitz, who I don't often agree with, is saying, Congress can either just close all these courts.
The courts is what they're saying. I've heard.
All of them, or some of them, whatever. And that's the direction we need to go in. And let these people who are burning Teslas, and back on Tampon Tim for a second, that moron dressing up the way he dressed up with those Bozo the Clown shoes, getting up on a stage and basically inciting violence. Think about that. That guy, for the grace of God, you see how his mind works now. He's out of power. Imagine what this idiot would have done with Kamala Harris had the two of them been in power. To get up on this, people are coming very close to killing other people in protest of somebody who should be celebrated. Forget about his politics. Elon Musk is an immigrant. So in one generation, less than a generation, this person, as an adult, has created numerous companies that employ, all told, probably hundreds of thousands of people. He's created billions, if not almost trillions of dollars of wealth. He's a young man with a lot of grand plans that, to bring those plans into fruition, are going to require a lot of more employees. And this fucking moron, Waltz, gets up on a stage and says that, I look at my watch every now and again, and I'm cheered when I see Tesla stock, when Tesla stock goes down. Fuck you, Tim Waltz, and fuck all, the people who would celebrate this loser. Then there's I find retard brought this to my attention on X this morning. His daughter is in a car filming herself saying that any boy who doesn't want tampons in the boys' room is weird. Okay, that's how your mind doesn't work. I mean, this is a very weird man and a very weird family. Why was he selected to be the vice president to an idiot? And how democratic was the process of dumping Joe, who at least pretended to campaign in the 2020 primaries? You dump him because he does a bad job. You should have screened him way earlier. And in an anti-democratic process, you select this idiot who literally slept her way into politics. To be brutally honest.
She's a buffoon. She's a total buffoon. But Charles, we're almost out of time here. We're going to continue the conversation in the First Amendment Forum. People who are sponsors, of course, will join us there. If you aren't, please become one. Join the show on odyssey.com/@crowdsourcethetruth, crowdsourcethetruth.substack.com, or subscribestar.com, or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Don't go away. We'll be right back. A lot more to discuss. NASA, people are bringing up the space